Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 9th Belle R. and Joseph H. Braun Memorial Distinguished Lecture here at the John Marshall Law School. This lecture series is made possible through the generous bequest of Mr. Joseph Braun, who was a graduate of this school, a member of the class of 1918, and a prominent Illinois attorney for 7 decades. And it's his generosity that's made this possible over the years. The book of Ecclesiastes tells us that he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. That's not a terribly pleasant thought for those of us involved in higher education, but I think I know what the author meant to say, because as we gain knowledge and we gain the ability to do things that years ago we could only imagine, our anxiety over whether we should do them and how the law should respond to these new capabilities becomes more and more intense. Certainly, no field of inquiry presents these problems more than the field of bioethics, and few people are more qualified to wrestle with these problems than our speaker today, Dr. Arthur Caplan. Dr. Caplan is the director of the Center for Bioethics and trustee professor of bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his bachelor's degree from Brandeis University and his master's and doctorate from Columbia University. Prior to assuming his current position, he served as instructor at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, associate director of the Hastings Center, professor of philosophy, professor of surgery, and director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Caplan is serving and has served on a number of government advisory committees, including the President's Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veterans Illnesses, President Clinton's Health Care Task Force, the Office of Technology Assessment of the United States Congress, American Foundation for AIDS Research. He's currently chairman of the Advisory Committee to the Department of Health and Human Services, Center for Disease Control and Food and Drug Administration on blood safety and availability, and that's where he was before he came here this week. He's published hundreds of articles and reviews in professional journals of philosophy, medicine, health policy, and the biological sciences. He's the author of several books, including Due Consideration, Controversy in an Age of Medical Miracles, Moral Matters, Prescribing Our Future, Ethical Challenges in Genetic Counseling, and I'm sure he wants me to mention his most recent book, which is Am I My Brother's Keeper, recently published by Indiana University Press. Today, Dr. Caplan will turn his attention to a subject which has certainly been in the headlines recently. He will discuss the ethical problems presented by cloning of humans and animals. So without further ado, Dr. Arthur Caplan.
Thank you. I have been, from listening to that introduction, I've been doing yeoman service and contributing to human suffering. Keep pumping out those articles that people have to decide what to do with. Basically, add them up at tenure promotion time, I guess, or something. The last time I was in Chicago to give a talk was at a school of law. It was at Illinois Institute of Technology, Chicago, Kent. It was in December. The subject was cloning. And as a result of that talk, I created Dr. Richard Seed. Dr. Seed is the fellow who had a brief meteoric rise into popular acclaim as the person who declared that he was going to do cloning. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him and what he represents, but I will say that the reason he enjoyed part of his ascendancy was that talk that I gave at that time about cloning was taped, and parts of it were put on public radio. And out of the audience came Dr. Seed to say that he was going to clone people, no matter what anybody said, and right away, too. And that was taped, too. And when the public radio broadcast a couple of excerpts from my talk, they also broadcast his statement or question. And as a result, the world knew that Dr. Seed had to be taken seriously and that he would do what he said he was going to do because it was on public radio. And they don't make that kind of thing up there. They talk in soft voices, and they have fundraisers, and they're trustworthy. I don't know if he's here today, but I don't want to do that anymore. That last experience wasn't too good. I didn't think Dr. Seed was actually anybody worth listening to then, and I don't now, but I'll explain why he holds a lesson in the reaction and thought about cloning. Let me tell you a little roadmap of what I'm going to do in this talk. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why cloning is of interest scientifically. I'm going to offer you some thoughts about what the initial reaction was to cloning, and cloning became publicly known in the form of Dolly on February 23rd, 1997, so not that long ago. I'm going to offer some comments about why it is that people don't believe that ethics, maybe the law, can do much to shape, regulate, or influence where we're going with cloning, and then I want to present some arguments about why I think they're wrong. And I'll wind up concluding with what I think really are some of the reasons to be concerned about human cloning. I think a lot of the reasons people are concerned about cloning are false reasons. They're not rooted in what cloning actually is all about and what it can do. But there are reasons, I think, to be concerned about human cloning. They might lead to legislation or legal restriction on what's going on. But unfortunately, I don't think we've had a discussion in this society about what those more serious reasons are. So I'll try and present what I think those reasons are, and we can then, at the end of all that, talk and question and back and forth about what you think about those reasons and what maybe conclusions you think they would lead to in terms of legal oversight of this area of science in this country. So let's go all the way back and say a few words about what cloning is. Cloning, to a scientist at Penn, at our Institute on Human Gene Therapy, one of the places that I wander around some, trying to understand a bit about genetics. Cloning merely means copying genetic material. That's all it means. It means taking DNA and making an exact replica of that DNA. Cloning, in one sense, has been around for at least 100 years. People have cloned cells, copied cells, found ways to make a cell reproduce itself identically in dishes. We call it cell culture, at least 100 years ago. It's a crucial tool in vaccine and drug development and in understanding basic mechanisms of biology. You know that when scientists do experiments at higher levels of animals, in fact, I gather there was a talk about this at lunchtime today about animal experimentation and animal rights. When people are interested in using animals for experimentation, whether that's right or wrong to do, and someone can tell me what was concluded at noon here from that presentation, but when they do it, they want to have uniformity of the animals. It is very important if you're trying to assess the safety or effectiveness or toxicity of something that you know that what you're looking at is a uniform animal population and doing a study. You don't want to believe that something's gone wrong or something is showing a bad side effect because there actually was a difference in the animals. So as best we can in medicine and science, people have been trying to breed animals that are genetically identical for a very long time. We haven't known how to do that with animals, but we've known how to do it at the level of cells. If you look at rats, which I'm sure many of you are inclined to do frequently, say a Norway rat or other types of knockout mice that are used in science today, they're not clones. They weren't made by copying DNA and growing the same organism again and again. But for practical purposes, they're real clone-like. They have been inbred and inbred and inbred for many, many generations to get the DNA the same. You can, in other words, get to the end result of having the same DNA through many routes. You could try to find a trick or a tool to get the DNA to copy itself, or you can try to breed adult animals and restrict who they breed with to get the same DNA to be present in a population of organisms. Dolly was very exciting as a cloned sheep. If any of you care to go to Scotland or New Zealand and try to do some sheep identification to sort them out, you'll have a very hard time. They're about as inbred as you're ever going to get. And they're not clones. They've just been bred to make a lot of wool and to eat about the same amount of food. And so de facto, one reality about the world of cloning is that people have been trying to achieve the copying of genetic material for all kinds of reasons for a long, long time, and with a lot of success. Dolly's friends on the hills of Scotland are not clones, but they are very likely to have about 99% of their DNA in common with Dolly, even without being clones, because people have been selectively breeding them to make wool and lamb chops for a long time. And that's true at the cellular level, that's true for rats and mice, and it's actually true for almost anything that you buy in the supermarket. You would be very disappointed to find out that in the apple and orange or pork chop areas of your supermarket, we actually let biological diversity flourish. What you're told when you go, if you look at ads for different supermarkets on TV, they show you their produce, and they don't say, here's a little apple and a big apple, and one has a dent in it, and one's kind of weirdly shaped. No one wants that. We believe that food should be standardized and uniform. The only way to get that is to breed it that way. Everything you ever saw in a supermarket, even a natural food supermarket, is a result of a lot of genetic engineering. A lot. There isn't anything natural in the natural food store, I'm sad to tell you. It may be better for you, but it's not natural. Nothing like that ever grew out in the woods. Even what grew in the woods probably got genetically engineered by somebody so that it would stay in the woods. You'd have to haul it out of the pristine rainforest and sell it at the natural food store to make it really a natural fruit, vegetable, or product. There isn't much out there that would really fit that. So a lot of genetic engineering going on. So to the scientist, if you say, well, you've cloned something, one reaction is to be bored. People say, well, you clone cells. We've known how to domestically inbreed animals for a long time, for all practical purposes. Everything that runs around laboratories, that's a rat or a mouse, a guinea pig. These are inbred to the point where they're genetically engineered to be identical, and they will be treated as if they are clones. So in one sense, it's a yawner to find out. There's another way to make something genetically identical, which didn't get much attention in all the yakking about Dolly, but it's a different way to, or it's a way to get something to be genetically identical. You can take DNA and actually match it up with other strips of DNA, and then put that DNA together with other bits of DNA, and you can sort DNA and get copies of the DNA, and scientists do that too now. It's actually one of the techniques when you hear about conversations about mapping the human genome and this big genome project. The way you decode genes is to match them up, known, let's say, letters of the genetic code against unknown ones. But you do a lot of copying to get there, and that's a form of cloning. Again, boring beyond belief to most scientists. If you'd announced that someone was doing cloning in that sense, people would say, well, that's pretty routine laboratory stuff. Another way to make a clone, and you'll know, anybody here have a twin? Anyone here have a twin they're proud of? The process of twinning does occur in nature. Many species show it. And one way to get a clone is to see twinning or tripleting or quadrupleting. The septuplets that were born to the lady in Iowa are clones. They have genetically identical DNA to one another. But the way that can happen is if an embryo in the course of development splits early into two separate creatures instead of developing as a single entity through time, sometimes for reasons we don't actually understand, embryos will divide themselves into two separate organisms. They don't just divide to make more cells, they actually divide completely. And that can happen to the point where natural births of quadruplets that are genetically identical has happened. Embryo splitting is a way to make clones. People have made clones from splitting embryos in the animal world for 50 years. It's very common as a way to breed bulls and goats and sheep to take their embryos of ones that you know turn out to make prize animals and divide them in a dish. And it is well known from animal work. Veterinarians know this, doctors less so. Veterinarians have much more experience with cloning actually than doctors, and that's why the cloning experiments about Dolly actually come from veterinary medicine. They don't come from biomedicine. They're at the veterinary end where people know a lot more about this. We know that up to probably 64 cells, you can actually chop an embryo in half, and you will not kill or damage the embryo. Those cells have the potential, each one of them, to reorganize themselves and produce a new animal that's healthy. And people have been doing that for a long, long time. So you can take embryos that have started, put them in a dish, and literally chop them up. Remember those things, some of you who got this far in your science classes in high school, remember chopping up planaria and they'd grow their head back and their little tail back? Well, embryos have that same property. It's called totipotency. It just means the cells are powerful enough to rebuild. And embryos, up until a certain point, have that, and then they lose it. They can't do that anymore. They can't make a whole new organism. But you can chop them up pretty early and make clones. So if we wanted to clone ourselves tomorrow, human beings, we could go to the in vitro fertilization clinic, take human embryos, and divide them. We know how to do that right now. It hasn't been talked about as part of the Dolly discussion, but if you really wanted to make a human clone, when people say, well, could we do it, and is it possible? It's absolutely possible. It's taking embryos and dividing them. And I'll tell you later on in this talk, actually somebody has tried this and got punished for doing it in an interesting way. But that isn't what Dolly was. Dolly represents a special technique. It's this thing, if you get a lot of your science, as I do, from checkout lines at grocery stores and go into the movies. In Jurassic Park, remember the way they made the dinosaurs was to pull DNA out of a mosquito that had bitten a dinosaur and had a bit of dinosaur blood in its gut, and then it had gotten stuck in amber. And then they somehow managed to get the mosquito out of the amber, the blood out of the mosquito, and then the DNA out of the mosquito's stomach and drop it into an embryo of another animal. I forget what they used. It might have been a platypus or some animal that they thought was evolutionarily related to dinosaurs. And that's where the new dinosaurs were grown that now populate the island in Costa Rica that is continuing to produce sequels. And that technique is what Dolly's all about. It is moving DNA from adult organisms into embryos and then using that DNA to grow new creatures that are genetically identical to the parent. People are fascinated about the idea that you could take DNA from an adult, extract it from a cell, put it into core out the DNA that an embryo has. Literally, by the way you do it is you take a little pipette, very scientific, and you poke a hole in the embryo, suck out the core part of the embryo, and you drop in the DNA from the animal that you've gotten the source DNA from, an adult, and then you sit back, you literally do this too, which is kind of funny. You actually shoot a little electricity into it to start it up, Frankenstein-like, and if you're lucky, you make a clone. The first experiments that showed it was possible to use cells from adults and take their DNA and drop them into embryos that had had their DNA removed and replaced were done in the 1960s by a man named J.B. Gurdon on frogs. And people have done adult cell-produced cloning, again, 30 years. But no one has ever been able to take that technology past the amphibian level. So what's the big deal about Dolly? Well, the big deal about Dolly was that she represented the first mammal made by this special way of cloning from an adult. She was made from an adult cell taken from the udder of another animal, actually cells that had been stored from that other animal, to tell you the truth. DNA was extracted from those cells, put into a sheep embryo, and 1 out of 277 efforts, Dolly showed up. Scientifically, people have not believed that mammals had the properties that would allow their DNA to turn back on to make another organism once it had become adult cells. Remember I told you about chopping up the embryos, and up to about 64 cells you could get them to make new animals because they're totipotent. You meaning they have the power to become any cells, embryo cells. They have to. If they didn't, then you wouldn't have a head or a foot. Every embryo has to have the power to produce all the cells that ultimately are us, or whatever a chipmunk or other lofty creatures. Whatever critter it is, the embryos of those things have to have the instructions in there to make all the cell types: immune system, blood type, hair, eyes. Once you get past a certain point in specialization, though, if you start chopping up the embryos, they can't make all the cells. So if you took a 3-month fetus, you can't divide that and get 2 babies anymore. They're losing the ability to make all the cells as division goes on. Many of you may have thought that the way things grow is by adding information. It isn't. It's by shutting off information. Everything is there initially, and then you start to see some genes shut off, and when they've completely shut down, you're making skin cells, hair cells, nose cells, brain cells, lymph cells, and all the rest of it. It's by shutting off instructions, not turning them on. In fact, if you turn them on, does anybody know what that is? It's cancer. You never want them all turned back on. It's unregulated growth and bad news. So in growth, what it's all about is shutting genes off to make specialized cells. Except, under some circumstances, if you take one of those highly specialized cells, Dolly's parent's breast tissue, udder cell, and put it in an embryo, lo and behold, when they fired it up once, it turned into another animal, showing that somehow or another that DNA in every cell in our body has retained somehow, in ways completely not understood, the ability to recreate other organisms like the one that originally turned into us, copies of DNA. So the fascination from a scientific point of view about Dolly is she defies something that everybody thought wasn't true, which is that you could turn adult DNA on again, drop it into an embryo, and it would become another adult. That somehow the capacity to make another creature from those instructions isn't lost. And if you get it in the right environment, put the right electricity into it, it'll start up again. Everybody assumed that was gone. Once you become a skin cell or a head cell or a gut cell, that was it. But here she comes. Now, some of you may have heard, and it may turn out to be true, that Dolly isn't a clone. Have you heard that discussion? It's sort of broken out in the newspapers. And you're now in a position to understand what this is all about. If you get nothing else out of this talk today, you'll understand what this fight is about. I told you that Dolly was made from a breast cell. They were breast cells produced by an ancestral organism, and Dolly looks exactly like the ancestral organism, her ancestor, or I think it was her mother. She's a copy of her mother. Her mother, actually, you've never seen because her mother is dead. The cells actually were stored in a vial that were used to make her. So we don't know, you can't put Dolly next to the animal that she came from to see that they're duplicates. That's why you always see Dolly standing alone. Her mother gave her life for science, I assume. Or for milk, I don't know. Dinner, wherever she went. But she's not around. Critics, people suspicious that Dolly does not prove what everybody has believed to be true, which is that adult cells can't turn on again to make new organisms, think that if it came from a breast cell, maybe somehow a fetal cell from the pregnant mom got in there, and Dolly has been made from a fetal cell that somehow got into the tissues of the breast, because if her mother was pregnant, fetal cells circulate in the mother's body. And so the real proof is Dolly truly this weird kind of clone made from an adult cell, not from a fetal cell? That's what the debate is. I think there's some reason to worry that Dolly isn't a real adult cell clone. And we can't answer the question definitively as to whether she is, because her mother is dead. And we just have this bunch of cells in a jar that were used to try and produce a copy. Critics of Ian Wilmot and the Scottish scientists said, why did you use that? That's a tough thing to go back and replicate, and we're suspicious that if it's a mother who might have been pregnant and used breast cells, maybe you got a fetal cell in there. Making animals from fetal DNA would not be as impressive, because it turns out that has been done in other species besides the frogs. Fetal DNA is more flexible and does have more capacity. It's not totipotent, but it's younger, so to speak, and it can be used under the right circumstances to make an entire organism, and we've got that kind of cloning going. So it wouldn't, I mean, it would be interesting, but not as exciting as showing that you could take something adult, whereas in the case of Jurassic Park, something that died 1 million years ago, but the DNA would be preserved, and try and get that to turn back on and make a copy. of what had been before. So Dolly may not be true, and adult cell cloning may not have been demonstrated. We'll see. My little birdies tell me that something's going to come out about this in the next week or 2 weeks. It is very suspicious that Dolly hasn't been replicated. There's only one Dolly. There's no other adult cell clone. You've heard reports in the news. Jean, a cow that has been cloned. Jean is a fetal cell clone. She's not, that wasn't the same kind of organism as Dolly. It was made from moving fetal DNA into an embryo of a bull and then making a copy. It's not the same thing. Now, what difference would it make if we're talking about copying genes? Well, in one sense, not a lot. In another sense, quite a bit. If you wanted to make another Art Caplan, the only way you're going to be able to clone him is if you kept embryos of him. If adult cell cloning isn't possible, then I'd have to have my embryos kept and I could split them and make more of me, but it wouldn't let me capture me back, or something that looked like me anyway, because it may turn out that the adult cell version doesn't work. If Dolly is real and someone else can actually get it to happen with some other organism, then maybe we can take cells from adults. The excitement of Dolly is that people are vain. They actually don't want to find out that you can copy embryos all the time. We could. I've already told you, I bet it's possible to make 1,000 copies of your children if we get their embryos and you let us chop them up. We could probably make many, many copies. You could have a lot of the same looking kids. I'm pretty sure that's true. But because we're vain and we think, well, I'd rather have copies of me, not some future not to be here yet thing, it's the Dolly-style cloning that fascinates us more. So that's the background to cloning. That's what's going on. A lot of arguing about whether Dolly's the real McCoy or not. A lot of people doubt it because they don't believe that basically scientifically adult DNA carries that capacity to somehow turn back on and make something else out. When she appeared and was announced, people were like, whoa, this is a major scientific bit of news, not because it's Dolly, but because it means the genes are much more flexible and much more able to be adaptable and do things than we ever thought. I mean, it opens up the possibility of turning lots of genes back on for many different cells, and that's where you hear about the idea maybe we could grow heart cells or bone marrow cells or other things. If they are that flexible, maybe we could start to grow lots of the stuff that would be compatible for us if we needed organs and tissues and so on. So it's the science, actually, that excites the scientists. Well, you'll recall that there was a lot of reaction to the announcement of Dolly back there in February 1997. A lot of reaction. I haven't done a careful study of this, but I pulled up some of the comments, some by scientists, some by people in bioethics, and they said, well, Dolly, gosh, that's something we really have to think about because obviously one thing that could happen is people could achieve immortality by cloning, and that would be very attractive. If you could copy yourself, you could live forever. That would be very exciting if Dolly is true. Another thing people said is if you had lost or were losing a child that was dying, you could pull cells off and have a replacement of that child. Another comment I saw was that, well, this cloning could be dangerous because what if Saddam Hussein or some other, I don't know, Bill Clinton, some other bizarre ruler were to copy himself many times, and you'd have clone armies marching down the streets of Washington. And in fact, people then realized no one cared if anybody was marching down the streets of Washington, so they tried other cities shortly thereafter where people might be bothered if they were destroyed. That's a little Republican joke for you there. And not my party, but some people said maybe we could grow people using this technique to be our sources of parts for organs and tissues. So we'd have our own clone that would kind of follow us around and be there as a spare part factory. Well, I've explained enough to you, I think, about what cloning is, that you should be able to see that most of those ethical worries about cloning are nutty. They don't make any sense. If I copy your DNA and drop it into an embryo, and lo and behold, it does work to make you Dolly style, it isn't you. Dolly is no more the same animal as the organism from which she came, as twins are identical people because they have the same DNA. I mean, I don't think you have a metaphysical crises if you're trying to discern whether you're the same as your twin. You may, as I noted earlier, not be happy that you have this twin, but it's probably not a personal identity thing about am I different or am I my own person. Even Siamese twin, you want to, yeah? But that addition is crucial. That addition is the crucial part. Raised in your bizarre household with your fascinating parents in the rotten small town that you grew up in, you might in fact produce two people that are pretty close in behavior and outlook and memories and so forth. But it doesn't come from your DNA, it comes from your upbringing. It comes from what your environment is, it comes from what shapes you. You could in fact make, let's say hypothetically, that Dolly style cloning is true and we grab cells off of Michael Jordan and we try to grow a couple more. Maybe he turns out to be a basketball player. Maybe he doesn't. If we tell him that his father was a great basketball player and that's why we wanted him to be one, I will bet on adolescence and say that therefore he will not be a basketball player. He will play the cello or something. He won't be interested in that at all. Even for people who have 50% of their DNA in common, you and any kids you might have, you can't get them to do anything. And that's at 50%. So even at 100%, development, environment, nurturance, these are not irrelevant, and that's part of what cinches the case up about what makes you who you are. It's not just your DNA. You aren't going to be immortal. If you clone yourself, you're going to have people that are copies of your DNA who look a lot like you, for sure, but they aren't going to be you. I even heard someone ask in some context, well, would a clone have a soul? Well, assumedly, if you have a soul and others have souls, then the clone should too. They're no less a person because they've been made out of DNA in some oddball dish electricity way. They still have all the other key properties. So personal identity, soul, that isn't a problem, and you're not going to achieve immortality by making genetic copies of yourself. You'll have immortal lines of people who look like you, but it won't be you. Another way to put it is, if you believe in immortality is the reason to clone, when you're dead, your clones won't care much. They'll be there doing whatever they're doing, and they're not going to care a lot about the fact that your hope was for immortality, but now you're dead. That will be a reminder that this is not a road to immortality. If you think about replacing a dying child, well, you could make a copy of a child that was dying, but you wouldn't have the same child back. You'd have a kind of copy, genetically. It might not even have all the exact same appearance because, of course, you'd have to feed it the same things and raise it in the same way and have it have the same falls and accents to be an exact duplicate of the child that you lost. And you might think about whether or not that would actually be a thing that you would ever want to do. And we'll come back to why that might be troubling. But it isn't a way to replace the dead or replace dying people. You're making new people still. They have many properties in common with those who might be dying or dead, but they're not the same as them. And the idea that you're going to have someone trailing around behind you for body parts. Well, it would be very nice in one biological sense to have someone who's genetically identical to you available, but I'm not a deep student of the law, but it does occur to me that before you saw their liver out, you might want to ask them if they consent to being available to you as a source of body parts. In other words, they don't lose their right to control their fate just because they've been cloned. They're still going to have, assumedly, a little chat about whether you're going to take out their vital organs when you need them. We haven't voided that just because someone got cloned. So this idea that we'll make clones and then they'll be around and we'll use them when we need them kind of flies in the face of some understanding of what it is that each person has the right to control about their person and body. Just because you're a clone doesn't make you any less able to have the right to control your person or to refuse to be nice. We've had many cases, those of you who looked at this area of the law, where relatives have refused to donate bone marrow and kidneys. We even had a case in Chicago not so long ago of a woman who had divorced and had a little boy who needed bone marrow, and they tried to go back to the little boy's stepbrother and ask a court to force just a test to see if there was even compatibility. These are close genetic relatives. They're not clones, but they're genetic relatives. And the court said, forget it. We don't have to succumb to any of this. We have no laws requiring people to make themselves available just because they're genetically related or identical to others. We already know what the answer to that is. Law, at least in this country, is not going to force people to make themselves subject to the whims of others, even to save lives or to provide tissues which wouldn't require their sacrifice. We've been down that road with people who are just genetically related by kinship, not by cloning. We know what the answer is there. Well, a lot of the arguments about what was wrong with human cloning were of that type, and they're not very good. They misunderstand cloning. They're not keyed into what cloning can do. But there's another major reason why people, I think, were not sanguine about stopping human cloning. Once Dolly was announced, this initial flurry of kind of immortality and replacing dying children and body parts factory stuff sort of faded off. And then people began to say, well, all right, why are we talking about human cloning? Because if it's been done in an animal, you know it's going to be done. There's nothing to do about it. We aren't going to stop human cloning. In fact, I heard this in discussions and debates every single time, any place I went, either someone on the panel or someone in the audience would jump up and say, well, what are we talking about? If we know how to do this in animals, it's just a matter of time before someone does it in people. And so we might as well just concede that we are going to have human cloning and stop having this symposium or stop having this discussion and go home. If we know how to do it, it will be done. You might take this as a version of the why take ethics seriously position. Why are we worried about ethics and law when it comes to human cloning? The first set of arguments weren't that persuasive because they misunderstood cloning. The next wave of reaction to cloning was, it's inevitable. I can think of actually 5 or 6 reasons why people believe that you're not going to stop human cloning. And I've seen these in the literature again and heard them in debates and discussions, seen them in the media. One is, well, there are powerful interests that want cloning. There's money to be made, powerful people will want to clone themselves, and you're not going to be able to stop them from doing that. Powerful interests will get what they want. Second reason is scientists should be free to do what they need to do. They have freedom of inquiry, and to try and legislate or regulate or ban or stop human cloning interferes with the basic right to inquiry to proceed where you want to go. A third argument, people have the right to reproduce and procreate. And if they have to do it by cloning, so be it, but it's nobody's business how you or I or anybody else make babies. That's a fundamental right that we have and cannot be interfered with. Another argument, ethics can't stop anything anyway, it never has, and for that matter, neither is law in science or medicine. You can move from the Holocaust up until the present day, see what has been done in the name of medicine and say nothing has ever been stopped. It's ridiculous to posit any ethical or legal restrictions. They don't work. This has a cousin argument, which is what I'll call the ethics lag factor. Ethics in the law, when science and medicine are concerned, are always behind. It takes them too long to catch up, and science and medicine are on to the next thing before anybody figures out what they're going to do to shape or regulate or restrict science and medicine. So that's hopeless. If you want to put it this way, ethics, law are just biomedically impaired and disabled. They can't understand it. The community's divided way back in secondary school. They don't overlap, and the scientists and doctors run rings around those who try to put limits or controls on them. And the last reason that no one believes or didn't believe after the first round of worries and concerns was evinced is that there is a strong belief in our culture in what can only be called the nut factor. Some nut will do this. And the reason that I'm so enamored of Richard Seed is that he was our nut. He was the living instantiation of the nut factor argument, because he was one nut. And I'll come back to him momentarily. Well, what about these arguments? That's what I'm going to look at next. Before I try and present some arguments to you about what I think are ethical reasons to worry about cloning, and maybe legislate, ban it, control it, shape it, I have to overcome this presumption that it's all a waste of time. And if you don't believe it's all a waste of time, I will tell you, every college group, business group, public group I talk to believes it's a complete waste of time. A complete and utter waste of time to try and stop human cloning. They don't believe it. They think it can't be done for all of these reasons that I've just gone through. They absolutely do not believe it. I haven't seen polls taken yet about skepticism about controlling human cloning, but I will tell you, I don't have to see the poll. I know, given talks about this and talking about it on TV and talking about it on call-in radio shows, well, that may be a weird subsection of the population, but there are large numbers of people who don't believe that for a minute anything that happens at this law school, at the legislature, anywhere else is going to shape, influence, stop, restrict human cloning. It will happen. The end. I mean, you can have symposia, you can write papers, all very nice. Going to happen. Well, it may be that human cloning has powerful supporters out there, interest groups, to go to that argument. And we're constantly reminded that big business wants to make big money. But the flaw in that argument is the big money in cloning is not in making humans. The big money in cloning is in making animals and cells. There may be a few people who wind up saying, yes, yes, sex is boring. I think I'll make my babies by cloning. But there aren't going to be a lot of them. And when you think about it further, let's say you decided, yes, I would like to have children kind of as a vanity license plate activity and make copies of me. I'm the best thing that ever happened, and more of me couldn't be bad to leave to the world, so I'll make exact copies of me. Aside from having this discussion with your mate about which one of you is this wondrous person to leave behind, most people want to reproduce so that they can mix or share with someone else the process of reproduction. That's a kind of human thing. There may be some of us who decide we'd like to turn this into a kind of solipsistic activity, but for most people, the whole point of reproduction is to make somebody with somebody else and then to be involved jointly in the project of rearing them. That's why people do it. They don't just do it as an isolated, solitary experience. There may be some people who are forced to choose cloning as a way to reproduce because they don't have gametes and they don't have partners, but there aren't going to be many of those. The money in cloning is to make lamb chops. The money in cloning is to make medicinal things that you can sell by having lots of it. The money isn't in human cloning. That is just, it's a misunderstanding of what the attractions and possibilities of cloning are. Once you take away the immortality and the replacing the dead child and the idea that I can be around forever, and you sort of think hard about it, there may be big business interests out there, but what they want to make is more flavor saver tomatoes, not copies of you. That's not going to turn out to be a lucrative business. That's not the reason. The cloning, human cloning, is not inevitable because of that. You might say, too, that, well, there is a right to reproduce and procreate, but of course, that's a negative right. And that's the right to be left alone and have no one interfere with you. But we haven't decided as a society yet whether we think there's a positive right to reproduce. Let me give you an example. Were I to hang around Chicago tonight and decide that I wanted to reproduce, I might approach people at bars this evening and inform them of this right that I have. That I'm interested in reproducing, and I've decided I'd like my right to be exercised, and they're the lucky winners. And I could get somewhere with this line of conversation, but it's probably unlikely. I'm not going to get to reproduce that way by asserting my positive right, because there isn't any positive right. If I'm single, the state doesn't supply me with a mate. If I don't have anyone who's willing to reproduce with me, I can't sort of go and claim an entitlement from anybody to get it. And certainly those who've struggled to get payment for in vitro fertilization, other infertility treatments, know there is no positive right to assistance. It doesn't exist. Cloning will fall into this category. This idea that you have a right to reproduce would have to mean, of course, that someone has to pay for it. You have to create the resources to do it. We'd have to enable people to do it. We haven't decided to do it. We haven't even done that for the existing reproductive technologies. So that isn't a reason to assume that human cloning is inevitable. The fact that people have a right to reproduce doesn't lead you to the conclusion that they have a right to clone. It could, but we'd have to create that. It's not just there prima facie. Well, if those arguments don't work, what about the view that science and the law can't stop science? Ethics and the law can't stop science and medicine from doing anything. About 6 months ago, I was at a hearing on cloning in Congress, and Senator Tom Harkin, not too far from here, from Iowa, said, I don't know why we're having this hearing. There's nothing that law or in this chamber or ethicists are going to do to stop science. Never have, never will. So we might take the view that science and medicine cannot be stopped or regulated or shaped or controlled by anything in law or ethics as Harkinism. And Harkinism is the view that nothing has ever been stopped by a moral argument. Science, in fact, is kind of like any of the various monsters that appear in Japanese science fiction films. It's like Mothra, or any gargantuan mutant radiation product of science fiction. They stride through the city, wreaking havoc, and nothing the puny humans can do will stop them. Rodan, any of them. They make Gulliver look like a midget among the Lilliputians. When science and medicine get going, the best you can do is grab the kids and get in a bunker and wait till they've stomped through. There's nothing to do about it. A lot of people believe this in our society. I think it is patent nonsense. It's patent nonsense for two reasons. One, although I have to add, it is shown in the culture every place. It is in Jurassic Park. It is in Lost World. It is in Boys from Brazil. It's in Gattaca. You can see it almost weekly in ER, in Chicago Hope, in Star Trek, in Babylon 5. I mean, it is a message that is in the culture very deeply that you can't stop science and medicine from going where they're going to go. The reason I laugh about this, almost hysterically if it wasn't so bitter, if you're on the science side of the street and you have to get a grant to do something, you know that you can't do whatever you want. You have to actually go out and persuade other people that they should give you money to do what you want, because the days at which you could do what you want in your own room in science and medicine ended about the time of Galileo, who needed a large iron ball to drop off the Tower of Pisa to make fundamental discoveries about gravity. Since that time, it has been a pretty costly enterprise, and society has to support it or it isn't going to get done. And the idea that single scientists or groups of scientists or doctors can launch off and do whatever they like and be accountable to no one and no one can stop them can only be espoused by anybody who's failed to put in an NIH grant. I mean, it's just silly. We control science all the time by the power of the purse. And in fact, when the federal government sees something it doesn't like, it immediately steps in and pulls the money out of it. To wit, there is no embryo research in the United States because the federal government won't pay for it. There is no fetal tissue transplant research in the United States. The federal government won't pay for it. There's never been any research in the United States on the reproductive technologies. The federal government won't pay for it. All the reasons the federal government won't pay for it are moral. They're objections from right-to-life groups who do not want to see those things done. They've been in place for 30 years, and it's why the first test tube baby was born in England. None of that stuff is done. It is absolutely not going on. I happen to think some of it should, but I will tell you, it doesn't. In 1947, we put out a set of rules about what you could do with human subjects in research. My former medical teacher at Columbia told me that when they wanted to get subjects in the 1940s in New York at Columbia, they would go down the Bowery, offer people on the Bowery warm meals in a bed. They would bring them up to Columbia, experiment on them through the winter, and then dump them out in the spring. That was subject recruitment. That's how they got them. That's what they did. They didn't tell them what they were doing, and they informed them of nothing. They don't do experiments like that anymore. They don't do the Tuskegee study anymore, where you lie to people and tell them you're treating them when you're watching their syphilis progress. Science and medicine actually are under very strict control and have their behavior shaped constantly by what they can and can't do with respect to the field of human experimentation. The problem in looking at the power of ethics and law to shape science and medicine is it is a bit like trying to detect barometric pressure and gravity and the impact of evolution over time. It's subtle, it's hard to see, but it's there in the environment all the time, and it's gradual. It doesn't happen with a bang, it happens in a steady, gradual way. But it's there all the time. It's there on the money end, it's there on the regulatory end. And even Tom Harkin knows, since he sits on the NIH Budget Committee, that when he wants a new institute created to study alternative and complementary medicine, which he does, he has to convince a whole lot of people that that's an area worth inquiring into before it's going to happen, because it wasn't happening and then it did happen. And that's the impact, if you will, of the law or legislation, taking science and medicine to places where they might not even want to go. But by putting a pot of money out there, you entice them to go there. It is just silly to say that there is no impact of science and medicine, in science and medicine, of ethics and law. It's false. Harkinism is just wrong. If we want to control human cloning, we can. You pull the grants out from it, you aren't going to have it. You ban it, you aren't going to have it. No more than we've had fetal tissue transplant research in this country. You could stop it dead in its tracks. And I might add, given where we are in genetics and where the rest of the world is in genetics, if you stop it here, you'll have stopped it more or less everywhere. Because we are the incontestable world leaders in genetics. I know Dolly was made, if it was true, in Scotland, but we're not the world leaders in sheep genetics. But we are absolutely the world leaders in human genetics. And to make that experiment go, if you didn't pay for it here or banned it here, you would bring it to a long time halt. The ethics lag. Well, that's a problem too, but it's of a different nature. It's true that science and medicine are always racing racing ahead of where law and ethics seem to be, and there is a lag problem. I wouldn't deny that, but I will say this. The lag isn't because people can't detect what the ethical issues are. It's sometimes that we just don't get consensus in a pluralistic society about what we want to do. Remember, I mentioned that argument saying science and medicine should be free to do what they want to do, freedom of inquiry. There are many people who don't want to regulate human cloning because they think it is intrusive. They'd rather bet on creativity and scientific innovation and the, if you will, the forces of the market to sort out what will happen with human cloning. It's not that they don't think we could ban or legislate or stop it. They want to lag behind it because they don't think that, well, let's put it this way. They've looked at legislators, they've looked at biomedical scientists, they think cloning is better under the control of the latter than the former. They don't want to see the state legislature of Illinois decide where cloning is going to go. They'd rather trust in the people at the University of Illinois, at the medical school, to see where human cloning is going to go. That's a political decision. It's not an ethics lag. It's a political answer. And there are some who want ethics and law to lag behind because they don't trust legislation and law to do the job. But that's not an inherent lag problem. It's a decision that people sometimes come to, in our society in particular, that it's better to leave things unregulated and unsupervised than to risk missing out on or losing breakthroughs and advantages. Well, these are all the reasons that people have put forward. I get to at least sneer a little bit about the last one. You'll remember the nut factor. Only in a society terrified of what nuts can do with technology could Richard Seed spend any time talking to Ted Koppel on Nightline and being interviewed on the front page of newspapers. Richard Seed has as much chance to clone a human being as any of your family members. I'm thinking here about your twin again. Richard Seed has no money. Richard Seed has no knowledge. Richard Seed doesn't know anybody who knows how to clone anything. And if you were setting out to start an enterprise to clone, you don't have to call up a guy who's broke and whose house was just seized for default of tax payment and say, would you like to join me in this frontier activity? I think I need your advice and your input to do it. He brings nothing to this table. Nothing. That's in fact why he has, thankfully, disappeared. We haven't heard from Richard Seed again, and we won't. But he represented something. His scary visage loomed forward from the TV screens, and he proclaimed, I don't care what laws are passed. I don't care what anybody says. I'm cloning. I have people to help me, and it will be done. And if you don't let me do it here, I'll go to Bimini. The idea, by the way, of taking a 25-person team, and you really need some experts in embryology and human genetics to make this thing go, and running this thing in Mongolia is quite the, again, only a society that doesn't understand its science and its cloning would even credit for a second the view that some nut is going to move a team of people to the outer Cayman Islands to run a cloning factory to make human beings. Remember, by the way, Dolly was successful 1 out of 277 times. That means that 277 surrogate mothers, sheep, were needed to put those embryos into, along with 277 embryos provided by somebody. To start your cloning enterprise, not only do you need the scientists, you're probably going to need at a minimum 300 surrogate mothers to carry the embryos around that you're making of these human clones to be. Not cheap, not easy to find them. I know there are a lot of people looking for work, might beat McDonald's and sort of $6-an-hour jobs, but it's going to be hard to find the kind of thing you're going to need to put together. And I don't think Richard Seed was the man to do it. So why did we take him seriously? It's because, again, we don't understand cloning technology. Cloning, if there are ethical reasons to worry about it, has nothing to do with public safety. The reason Richard Seed scares us is that what we're used to in America is being afraid of technology from the nuclear age. We're afraid of people who get nuclear weapons and make small ones and lug them around. We're afraid of people who get chemical weapons and lug them onto subways. We're afraid of terrorists who make powerful bombs and blow up buildings like Oklahoma City. We know what the power of physics is, and we know that in science and technology there are some threats to us that can result in destruction to millions by the acts of a single individual. Now, I'm going to announce something to you, just in the spirit of Richard Seed. I hope no one's taping this for a public radio broadcast, but I'm a clone. And in fact, I've made my son a clone. He's a clone too. We're all the Caplan family clone. I was cloned and my son is a clone. Let's say that's true. How do I threaten you if I am a clone? In fact, I don't. There's nothing at all threatening to the public health or safety in any way, shape, or form if we made a clone. We might have an interesting, you'd be threatened in the sense in which Geraldo Rivera would be on TV interviewing this clone round the clock for the next year, but short of that, there'd be no threat to anybody. Cloning is not the same as the legacy of physics, the Cold War, the nuclear age, and terrorism. What we did with Richard Seed was we imposed our fears about technology that we've learned about physics and chemical weapons and the age of, if you will, 20th century, which is physics, and tried to use those fears to understand cloning, which is a 21st century version of what physics was to the 20th century. Genetics will be to the 21st. But cloning is not the same. Cloning doesn't threaten anybody else. Even if you made 100 clones, I dare say even if you made 1,000 clones, no one is threatened, no one is harmed, no one is put in peril, no one is put in danger. That is not the moral issue. Nuts could make clones. So what if they did? Let's presume that he could. Who's threatened? No one is threatened. Nothing happens. It's a curiosity, interesting, be a scientifically interesting thing, but a nut with the power to clone is not the same as the nut with a nuclear bomb or a chemical weapon or a biological agent. These are not the same types of threats. Cloning is not of that sort of thing, and it is only a society that doesn't have the foggiest clue or hasn't sat down to think hard about what cloning is that Richard Seed could come out and terrorize us by his threats to clone. Because, in fact, this is not a public health or a public welfare issue at all. I tried to tell you what the initial worries were that people had about cloning. Immortality, making body farm factories, replacing the dead. Dismissed those and said, cloning doesn't do that. Doesn't give you any of that stuff. Those are lousy moral arguments not to make human clones. And people began to say, well, why not make human clones? And I tried to review with you some of the arguments that they came up with. Well, powerful people want it. There's a lot of money to be made. They'll do it for that. No. The money is in the animal and cell world. It's not in making human clones. Most people aren't going to be interested in that. They don't want to copy themselves as a way to asexual reproduction. Not true. There isn't a right to clone. We'd have to decide to make it, so that's not a fundamental reason why it's going to happen. Ethics can stop technology and science if it wants to. It's done it in your lifetime. In many areas, you may not be alert to it all the time because it does it quietly, but it's done it. It's done it to the dismay of many scientists who wish that we would change the law about things like fetal tissue transplant and allow inquiry to proceed. There is a lag of ethics, but it's often a lag of choice, not of inadvertence. We can anticipate lots of issues in reproductive technology and genetics and flag them. Bioethicists have been talking about cloning at least for 20 years since I've been in the field and nailed most of the issues. People have chosen not to regulate it. Okay, that's a decision, not a reason that something's inevitable. And the idea that a nut will do it misses the mark of what cloning is and is irrelevant anyway, because the nut isn't going to do anything dangerous even if they did clone somebody. Having said all that, what I want to conclude with is to tell you just a bit about what I think are the ethical arguments that are real about cloning. What are the real persuasive problems? And the way I would try to shift the framework is this. I think the ethical problems with human cloning, and the reason you might want to not let it happen, or ban it, or control it, or regulate it, are solely based upon what's in the interest of the clone, not in the interest of everybody else. You might put it this way. Is it in your best interest to be a clone? Are there reasons to be concerned if you were cloned that it wouldn't be good for you or the person who is the clone? I've tried to argue pretty vociferously that there's no reason to presume that a clone is a threat to anybody else, and I haven't heard any reason to think that a clone is any more of a threat to anyone else than anybody else is. No reason to presume that at all. So it can't be as a public health, public welfare ethical objection that anybody would regulate, stop, or try to shape cloning. That isn't it. I think it's got to be on a best interest standard for the clone. The arguments fall into two broad categories. One is it's safe. There are many reasons to think it might not be a good thing to try and make a human clone today. Let's look at Dolly. One fact about Dolly is, I don't know if you know this, she's twice as big as she's supposed to be. Now, there are two reasons that could be true. One is everybody who comes to see her feeds her. That's possible. And she gets visited a lot. She's a curiosity. A lot of people go there. Another reason is she's growing incorrectly. That the DNA that was used to make her from an adult carried with it mutations and genetic damage that every adult cell has in it. All of you in this room have some damage to your DNA. It comes from X-rays, radiation, chemicals in the environment. Your DNA is changed over time. It's part of the reason that we go through aging. It's part of the reason that we're probably subjected to cancer, because some of the control genes get damaged, and that's when that unregulated growth starts up again. If you use adult DNA to make an animal, you are transferring all those mutations and changes from the adult DNA back into the new animal. It is not, in fact, an exact copy. It's a copy of a deteriorated program. Is Dolly normal? Not sure. Will she age at the rate of a new animal or an adult animal? Will she get cancer or other problems of old age early or not? Unclear. We don't know, in fact, what it means to the health and well-being of an organism to be the product of DNA-created cloning from an adult. There are reasons to be very suspicious of it, because we do know that DNA, and the older the organism, the more damage the DNA. We know that. And that is a reason to be very suspicious about using that starter program as the way to make a new person. It may not matter for sheep. Most people love sheep for their bodies, not their minds. And people, it may matter a great deal. It may matter a great deal. You might say another reason not to make human clones is that the cost of making them would be enormous. In Dolly's case, 1 out of 277 fertilized eggs turned into a sheep, but there were also 13 aborted fetuses. Ratios like that may be acceptable in sheep. They're not acceptable in people. People would not find it acceptable to create 13 defective humans and to have the other 250 embryos die at different stages of development to try and create one Dolly. In fact, it's a natural limit, too, in the cost of doing reproductive technology for human cloning. Now, you might say that will improve, but again, we don't know that it will. It may turn out to be inordinately hard to make adult-style clones. That may be one of the limits of that technology. One other reason it is not safe and in the interest of anybody to be made a human clone, and I hate to put it so crudely and bluntly, but it is absolutely true. You don't start making human clones based on a successful animal experiment series of one. You might want to try it, say, in a goat, see if you can get it to work in a monkey, try a chimp. You want to come up the evolutionary scale to see what's going on, to see if there are any differences between what's going to happen in primates and what happens in mammals. It would be barbaric for someone to try and make a human clone today based on one uncertain outcome in a sheep. Most clinical trials, meaning human experiments, don't start based on a success rate of 1 out of 277 in sheep. In fact, if someone tries to do that kind of work, human work, on that kind of scientific evidence, we usually take all their grants away. So you can't do that anymore. So it is certainly not in the safety and welfare interest of anybody to be made a human clone anytime soon. We ought to be regulating that vigorously, immediately. Should we have a ban or a moratorium just on safety grounds alone? There should be an absolute moratorium on making human clones, just for those 3 reasons. Don't know the outcomes, tremendous, devastating reproductive cost to do it, if it works at all, and you better do it in some other species to make sure you understand what you're going to get out. Those are reasons that are in the interest of the clone. They're not in the interest of anybody else, but you've got to protect people from the risks imposed upon them by this technology in their creation. What other reasons? Well, the others, I think, outside of obvious safety worries, which would lead me immediately to call for a moratorium on human cloning for the foreseeable future, are, is it in the best interest of someone to be made a clone? And the question there is it, what would be troubling about it? And I can come up with 3 types of reasons here that it might be not a good thing to be made a clone, even if it was safe. One reason is this. If you are made in someone else's image, and that's what we're talking about here, then others are going to have expectations of you and react to you in ways that are complicated. Twins do not go through life having people treat them, they may have people react to them and treat them as unusual or interesting or fascinating because they have the same appearance. But they do not have to go through life knowing exactly what changes and biological events await them because they're not looking at the copy of themselves sequentially in time. You've heard a lot about genetic testing, and many of you have probably thought, well, if I had a risk of a disease, would I want to be tested? Would I want to know about breast cancer or Huntington's disease? Would I take that test? A clone is forced to undergo the biggest genetic test of all time because the DNA that he comes from or she comes from an organism that is already ahead of you in the lifespan, and you will see every biologically based genetic fact that there is to know about you. Your future will be restricted and knowledge will be forced upon you because you will know, I'm going to get bald at 40, I'm going to get stomach cancer for the first time at 50, I'm going to have a personality that is repugnant all my life, because I know those things are strongly genetic, and I know what's going on with my forerunner. I know all of it. I can't have an open future. I can't have opportunity. I can't become who I want to be because I'm forced to know, just by dint of having been made from someone whose future unfolds before me in the biological sense, much of what awaits me. If we are concerned that people have the right to choose or not choose about genetic testing for one trait, one stinky little trait, then to tell them that they're going to get them all may be a reason not to make someone a clone, because it narrows their freedom, it narrows their opportunity, it forces information upon them that they may not choose to have. A second reason, it complicates relationships. And I could go on about this, but it'd be easier to do it in the discussion, so I'll just tell you the description I've come up with. Let's call it the Woody Allen syndrome. Woody Allen, as you know, married his adopted daughter. This led some people to think that that was weird. Well, what's weird about it? Why is it wrong? He has no biological relationship to his adopted daughter. She has no genetic tie to him whatsoever. There's nothing incestuous here. No risk to their offspring should they have children of producing more people with birth defects because they are genetically related. This is not an incest case. What is wrong with it? Well, one thing that might be wrong with it is that sometimes people believe that the relationships and feelings and emotions appropriate to parenting should not then cross over into the relationships of a sexual partner. If I'm cloned, well, let's try it this way. If I am married and my wife decides that we will reproduce by cloning, here's the scenario I will face. The woman that I fell in love with will now be appearing before me 30 years, 40 years younger and going through the exact same appearance and looks that my wife does. And my reaction to this is what? I'll distance those feelings and suppress them, but of course they're the ones that brought me together with my wife in the first place. So how will I parent the thing that I fell in love with? Look, I'm not naive. I know that many of us have children because we relish the idea of passing a piece of ourselves off to the next generation. That's a driving force behind reproduction. But at the same time, if I said, well, there's something odd about saying, yes, I want to make something that is an exact replica and copy of me because I think one more Donald Trump or 10 of them or 100 of them is just what the world needs, and I'm convinced that I will do everything I can to make them just like me. I'm starting to move from creating somebody with the ability to become who they want to be toward manufacturing somebody or commodifying them toward the product that I believe I ought to be making. It's hard to capture the precise line where the drive to have some relationship to your offspring as a reason to continue family lineage or to have someone that echoes things and values and behaviors and beliefs that you consider important shades off into just manipulation and manufacture. But I think that's what the other problem is with cloning. We don't like to think of children as being the products of manufacture. If I said to you, well, what really would be wrong with having a company that made clones? It's because we start to look like we're literally putting them out on the assembly line in some manufacturing sense. Not bad for us, bad for them, potentially. Treated more like a product. I'm disappointed in you. I made you as a clone. You're supposed to be in business, and there you are, a poet. Now, dads say that to their kids all the time, but most of them aren't built hardwired to reproduce what dad wanted. So that the burden becomes even more onerous about that gap between what I want to be, if you want to think of it this way, the possibility of an open future, which I think every child might be entitled to, reduces to become what they want or who they want or to exercise their powers as they see fit and not have themselves hardwired to be what the creator or the manufacturer wants them to become. I don't know whether you find those arguments persuasive or not. The manufacturing worry, the idea that your psychosocial relationships, your emotional relationships with others are going to be made complicated and perhaps deleterious, and the idea that you're going to have your future told to you in ways that make it hard. For you to grow and develop, you'll have to carry much burden that others don't and haven't historically as in the way we've made people. Those may not be reasons to ban human cloning. I've given you one set of reasons that I think at least ought to cause us to put a moratorium on, and that's abject safety reasons. Those are incontrovertible. I can't believe we haven't done it. It is simple and easy to get that in place, and there's no reason that we shouldn't have done this in this society. Britain has done it. France has done it. Portugal has done it. Norway's done it. Germany's done it. The European Union has done it. Of course, none of that matters because we're the place that is most likely to do it. It's nice that Portugal has done it. I don't think I'm going to see human cloning there unless, I guess, Dr. Seed moves his overseas cloning enterprise to Lisbon or something. But short of that, we're the place that's most likely to have the capacity, and we haven't done it. On safety grounds, we should be doing it. On philosophical, moral grounds, maybe we want to think harder. Whether you find those reasons persuasive or not, what I've tried to convince you of is this. Cloning isn't like other technologies that you may worry about or fear or be disturbed by. It won't harm the rest of us. It's not going to result in a public environmental danger. It's not something that a terrorist could use, unless he wanted to wait a real long time. So I'm going to threaten your nation by cloning, so in 50 years the clones will be there. Just wait, you'll see. And if I can raise them exactly right, they'll do what I'll tell them. That isn't the kind of technology cloning is. And a lot of the things that people are concerned about with the immortality and the body parts and so on are just nonsense. A lot of people leave the argument and say, well, it doesn't matter anyway because we're not going to stop it. I don't believe that. We can stop it. The reasons, if we're going to stop it, however, I think have to do with, is it in the interest of any human being to be a clone? Do we care about what it means to be made asexually, in that way, in the image of someone else, and what that would do to your freedom, your opportunity, your development? That's where the argument is. And that's the argument I hope to at least engage you in today. Thank you. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, that'd be great. You can just pop your hand up in the air. And well, it's certainly the case that a lot of behavior, some of personality, a whole lot of our immunology and more organic activities are strongly genetically determined. And I'm not here to tell you, I'm willing to concede that a lot of what humanity is all about is written in its genes. At the same time, at the level that we're interested in, of Pol Pot or musical composers or great athletes, I don't think that's written in our genes. I think that there are tendencies and capacities, but I don't think there is the evil dictator gene or the asocial, I don't like others outside my ethnic group gene, the racist gene. I believe that there are tendencies and capabilities that can be put to all kinds of uses, or to put it another way, Pol Pot or Hitler or Mao or Stalin or whoever, I think turn out to be the way they are because they have traits and properties that are shaped and channeled and funneled by their upbringing. I don't know that there's that much difference, to be blunt about it, between, say, Colin Powell and Adolf Hitler. The same things that make them leaders or give them drive or give them creativity or whatever, put into the wrong environments and the wrong developmental circumstances, wind up in different places. But it's not the traits, or the dispositions or the skills, it's sort of how they interact with their parenting, their environment, their psychosocial development. So to say, well, we could identify the aggressive, or we could identify the moody, I don't think that's going to be the fear, so to speak.
No, I'm not suggesting you could identify it, but to the extent there is any coefficient of correlation between
Let me try.
Likely to shift it statistically.
Yeah, let me try it this way. What I think is true is that the properties we're talking about that lead to asocial behavior or dangerous behavior and so on are actually the same properties that lead to creativity and dynamism and so on. They're just funneled differently in the environment. So we can't weed them out by just saying, well, if we breed 10 more Pol Pots, then we're going to have 10 more potential vicious dictators who are going to commit genocide. I don't think that's the way it works. What I think we get is 10 more people who are dynamic and might attract a following and might have an interesting verbal set of skills, and they could very well turn out to be the next 10, TV commentators. Exactly the same genome, just shaped in different settings and contexts to produce something else. So I don't believe you'll shift the overall balance of likelihood of producing bad outcomes just by cloning the same set of genetic instructions. That tie is too tenuous. And the very traits and skills and abilities and capacities, I think, are in fact more uniform, both as they wind up in things that we would say are desirable and we would say are evil. It's not the traits themselves, it's sort of how they get shaped and influenced and pushed. To put it another way, what I've learned from my psychologist or social psychologist friends is when you start to profile and probe personalities and traits of, let's say, the good and the bad amongst us, the same thing that makes an aggressive CEO, whose sperm we try to store in the Nobel Prize sperm bank because we think it'd be great to have more of them, is the same thing that gives you, Al Capone. It's just that one guy happens to get to prep school and the other guy just runs around the street out there, so that they don't see it as sort of fine-tuned genetic distinctions at these overall capacities and abilities, and you're not gonna get that by trying to clone the desirable and avoid cloning the undesirable. You may wind up having no poets accidentally if you prohibit the cloning of, anybody who looked like they had prison tendencies or ever spent time in a felony, because it turned out those same things in different settings gave you what you wanted. So tricky business there, but I think it's more complex, and that isn't the fear that I have about, I wouldn't worry if tomorrow someone told me there's 1,000 copies festering somewhere in Iraq of Saddam Hussein. I don't think we're going to get any more likely in that 1,000 clone copies, dictators, human rights violators, enemies of the Kurds. Pick them up and dump them into the Kurds. You may have the liberator of the Kurds from the same set of genetic instructions. That's what I'm trying to get at. Mm-hmm.
It begs a different question. My ignorance. If I understood or understand what this embryo DNA thing is about, my DNA is a function of my parents.
Right.
So 50-50.
Right.
Now, this clone me
Yes.
is going to be 100% me.
Right.
Why then is not my clone other than human and understand it genetically and therefore, in fact, include a product rather than a fruit?
Because those genes, think of it this way. If I have computers running upstairs here in this building, word processors, they all run off the same software. We hope, if we've standardized. But let's assume we're lucky and we got all IBM machines or all Macintosh machines. So we all have Word 6.0 or something like that, or Windows 98. We're running it. Those are the genes. The disk, the program that we feed in the machine is it. You might say I could take half the word programs and put them in recombination with something else, and that would be the equivalent of sexual reproduction to the next generation, kind of recombining and seeing what the instructions would do if I mixed them up. If I copy them exactly, I still don't have the exact same outcome, because what matters is who's at the desk typing into that word processing program. We know that the outputs are restricted a lot by what word programs would allow us to do. You can't do Greek, you can't make music, no pictures, just words, but we can make a lot of different words and the outcomes are going to be very different. In fact, from a human point of view, what those outcomes are exceedingly different, even though to a Martian they might look like they're all the same 26 letters recombined, not so different. We think they're very different because we have all kinds of significance to tiny differences in their order and in their patterns, the language. That's the difference between the genetic part of who we are and the environmental part. It's as if we don't just equate ourselves, even as product, to say I've made 100% genetically the same program in this offspring of mine. I still have to feed in all this input to get an outcome. The parenting part, the environment part, the raising, and it relates back to this question before. I'm not going to be able to manufacture you because I still have some ability to know that the environment is going to have to shape you and turn you into the person as opposed to the product. If I changed it in this fashion, if B.F. Skinner met cloning, I literally took my clone and I then put it in a box and I raised it under the tightest of environments. Then I'm closer to what you're worried about. Then I'm beginning to manufacture.
But Mike, just so I am correct then that all human beings that we know are 50-50, and all
Yes.
clones as we move them
Or hundreds.
are hundreds.
Yes. And in fact, the fascinating thing about the 50-50s is they're 50%, but it's not the same 50. For the clone, it's the same 100. That is to say, when you and your wife have kids, there's a 100% possible gene pool, but it recombines, so it's always 50, but it's not the same 50%. So clones are actually a little closer in that sense of manufacture that you're going in than sex produces. Saying we're all 50% related, but I'm not 50% related to all my brothers and sisters. I could be, in fact, less related to them in theory than I am to a stranger just by dint of how the genes recombine. Even though I'm 50% related to my parent, I'm not 50% related to my siblings. Clones are 100% related to their parent, 100% related to their sibling. So in that sense, yeah.
I would assume that some of the pictures you expressed that you had would be subject to the same vagaries as some of the other people raised, considering the environment and nature of the
Right.
community. It's not clear to me that you would necessarily fall in love with your clone daughter because the thing that they told us was like wasn't just who she was, but because of who she was.
True.
But I really have not ever heard anyone talk about clones. One of the things that is fun and very interesting that I very much appreciate is the fact that you, regardless of what the upside or downside are, or would be in a given case, or generally speaking, it's rare to hear stuff with your talk about clone and human beings. They tend to be human.
Yeah, immediately to you.
And in my mind, when I think about it, I think of them as almost machines, or again, sort of like what we think are to the extent that we So I'm just very glad to have a different perspective from this course. I'm experiencing sort of a paradigm shift.
Weirdly enough, I think that clones, even though presumptively we could worry about manufacturing them in some high-tech sense of that, there's no reason to think intrinsically that they're any less persons or human or have any less claim on rights and protections than anybody would. They're certainly no less members of the human species and no less entrusted with whatever special natural rights we want to accord just by dint of their cloneness. Weirdly enough, my objection is that as we tip toward manufacturing or start to view them as cheapened or commodified, that's the reason not to do it. But that's us and how we react to them. It's not intrinsic to them. There's nothing intrinsic about it.
Something I found intriguing was your point about the discussion of human cloning, that the paramount interest is the clones, coming at it from the standpoint of autonomy and privacy.
Right,
therefore,
right.
The consent we get is the clones.
Right.
And so we have kind of a catch-22, so we've got a time machine. That's another reason for saying we're not clones.
Yes, and I'm sort of edging toward that argument. I'm not sure if you want to put it this way, in doing any experiment on human beings, when they can't consent, children, fetuses, mentally retarded, mentally ill, we tend to say, well, then you've got to hit a higher standard. Since they can't look out for themselves and make their own choices, we want to try and do things that we at least would say would be to their benefit. So we don't take retarded children and just use them in drug safety studies. We could. We don't. The idea is to protect the vulnerable who can't look out for their own interests by saying, well, we at least try to have the intent of helping them or doing something that might benefit them. So how does cloning fit in if it can't be there to get the consent of someone? Well, would you want to know all this information about your genetic fate, and would you want others to perhaps have weird reactions? You'd say, well, you don't talk like your father. You're exactly the same. You look just like him. You remind me of him, but you stink. You're a lousy public speaker, or you have no ethical thoughts. Why? I'm disappointed, you know. Well, we can't consent them to that. Then these worries about emotional, psychosocial development and safety start to weigh as to whether we're going to then say, okay. I can't tell you that I've gotten myself to the point of view where I've said never. In principle, human cloning, this violates too much. I can't say that. I just would like us to at least, A, pinpoint where the worries are, and B, then at least reflect harder about whether it would push some of us over the edge. It pushes me over the edge right now purely on safety ground. It would not be a good idea to make a clone tomorrow. That would be to impose absolutely unacceptable risk and probably a lot of harm on the clone. I mean, physical, just harm. Down the road, the psychosocial, the emotional, the personal identity stuff, that, I think, is a close call. I don't know. But it comes back to what we were just talking about here. If you dehumanize the clone, you don't realize that the weirdest aspect of this argument about human cloning actually is, are we going to do something that's unfair to them? It would take away their personhood or their ability to flourish or their ability to be their own person, because they should be. But it's us who might react weirdly enough to them. It's us who might actually make their existence miserable. You might take it out at one extreme and say we'd only allow human cloning if we promised never to let any journalists near the human clone for 10 years. I mean, it's sort of, imagine what would it be like just to be the septuplets. They're going to be on TV the rest of their lives. I saw an interview not too long ago with the Dion Quince, and they said, it was the worst. All they did was treat us as freaks. They're not dehumanized things. They're people too, but they were turned into objectified somethings or others because we're not used to seeing people made in litters. That's odd. But we do that. So I don't think there's anything, as I said, it's not the intrinsic, it's not weird to be one of a litter. You're okay, you're a person, you can do whatever you want. It's not weird to be made a clone, you just have DNA constructed in a funny way. But lots of other social and psychological things happen as a result, and that may not be good for you. You can hear me struggling to say, I'm tempted to say never, but I can't. All I can say is, gotta think about that. Maybe we can do 2 more back here, and then I'll come over here.
It's really a good focus on whole person clone. I've heard a lot of scientists talk about, well, the real benefit is not whole person clone, but cloning an organ.
Right.
We have a shortage of liver, we have a shortage of heart. What's your thoughts about that?
Okay. At one extreme of the let's make clones, was the thing I was laughing or sneering at about, well, we're not going to make people just as our slaves to saw their parts out. All right, so short of put that aside. I have heard people then propose, well, maybe we can make deformed people. How about people with no heads? You may have seen that discussion. Medically, making someone get to adulthood with no head would be quite an expensive, if not completely impossible, enterprise. It may not have occurred to those people who like to speculate down that scenario, the headless human body part thing, that people need their heads for most of what they become, that it drives their hearts. To do this would cost you a lot more money. So that option, just on practical grounds, aside from the issue of whether it would be all right to make a deformed human intentionally, which would probably violate a medical ethics principle, take them out. So let's then take it down to let's construct a liver, let's construct a heart. What about making bone marrow? I think it's going to turn out to be very practical, useful, and lucrative to do this. And I think it's going to be wonderful to do this. I think that it is very likely that we're going to be able to make islet cells that make insulin, bone marrow, blood, and other cellular products. I doubt, however, we're going to be able to make livers and hearts and solid organs. And the reason is biological. Those organs need environments in which to get their structure. It's going to be weird to think about trying to grow a heart with 4 chambers in a dish just sitting there. You'd have to get it to get all the information that the cells use to order themselves into a heart. But there are other cells and tissues that we have, liver cells. I hate to insult our bodies, but they're just kind of blobs of things. And it doesn't matter if they're growing in cubes or spheres or whatever, they'll work. And that stuff is what's going to be farmed. And when I was laughing and saying the money isn't in human cloning, the money is in this. And some other time we can come back and say, well, should we patent it? Who should own it? How should you make it available? Those are great questions. I enthusiastically look forward to the day where someone could say, we're not going to be short on immunoglobulin, something I've had to worry about the past 2 days. And we have a shortage in this country, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do about it. I'd love somebody to make me synthetic immunoglobulin by cloning. I hope they make it tomorrow morning. I'm a little nervous that they might sell it to me at $2,000 a gram, but that's a different issue, and one that's not unfamiliar to commerce and business and the law. So I think that's an exciting prospect. That is where the money is. In fact, that's where the attention of industry is. Pache Dr. Seed, no one is running out to say, well, let's start the human cloning thing and get that off the ground. Bayer and Land O'Lakes and every biotech and pharmacy company you can think of are moving toward how can we get in there and make sure we're ready to try and produce products that are cloned cells and cloned tissue. So I don't think we'll ever replace our hearts or solid organs, but I think we're going to see a ton of this in medicine the next 10, 20, 30 years. By the way, the other good news about that is, even if Dolly was a mistake, and it turned out to be one of the great disappointments, we thought we had an adult clone, you can still get this kind of tissue by just getting some of the DNA to turn back on, and that's probably more doable. So you don't need the whole organism, you just got to get the business end of the darn chromosome that makes blood cells to turn back on, and you can make albumin and immunoglobulin and swim in this stuff. So I think that's a good part of cloning technology.
Probably already revealed too much. George's question, comment that, first of all, I thank you for standing up for that. That's exactly what
Okay.
but when you said emotional, psychological, psychosocial reasons were not as strong as possible.
Mm-hmm. Right, should fade. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would certainly vote that pessimistic assessment. And you have more bitter experience about this than I do, but I tend to think that maybe over time the same adjustments and the same, I mean, look, people at one point believed that if you were born from cesarean section, you were a freak. There was a worry that test tube babies would be treated as bizarre, that made outside the body weird forms of conception. There was even a time I remember learning in the history of obstetrics, forceps delivery, which is kind of, what the hell weighs that to enter the world? You yanked in by somebody pulling you out. That can't be. We have made adjustments over time to some forms of how technology shapes our creation and how we get here. No one cares today whether someone was born in a neonatal unit. That is the artificial womb, period. That's what it is. Very few people run around saying, well, I feel less a person because I wasn't born in my mother's womb. I was born in some electricity-driven incubator. Maybe cloning will have that same impact over time that the safety and cost things do too. So that's what has me hesitating. I know that there's been adjustment once people have understood it. On the other hand, it does mean a few other, maybe I can end these remarks this way. It would be great, for example, if we might study the first human clones to see. We never studied the first test tube babies. We've never studied any septuplets. We presume that this is somehow something that's none of our business, but it is our business to be able to answer this, and it's partly empirical. We could insist as one regulation that when and if this happens, those kids are going to be followed for a while before we set up the companies. We just like to know maybe 10 years worth of outcome. That'd be nice to know. Adoption suffers from this. It's hard to know whether that works or doesn't work or what its impact is. We're sort of, when we get into cross-racial adoption, these other ways of parenting, we're often sort of in a sea of ignorance, but we could have studied it more if we cared about the kids and their interests. And the other comment is maybe it will be possible to at least then say, well, let's check the circumstances under which people want to do this. It won't just go to cash customers. If we make an assessment like we would an adoptive parent, that they seem reasonably sane and they have a stable environment in which to raise a child and so forth, okay, that's at least a minimal thing before you can be the first clone parents. That we're not going to just let felons and, I don't know, anybody who wants to take this on. So there may be ways to shape it, at least that would keep an eye out for the interests of the person to be made in this novel way. And that would be a partial regulation or shaping of what's going on. So those may be ways, they're not quite to bans forever, but they might shape or restrict what's going on. Well, you've been very indulgent in putting up with this ranting and raving for a long time. I can tell you that if you're interested in cloning and want to sort of see more about it, I can plug one other thing. On a website that we have at the Bioethics Center at Penn, which is www.medmed.upenn.edu/bioethics, which, by the way, I'm astounded at this. After Dolly appeared, is now getting 140,000 visits a week to this thing. And actually, you may not be able to get there, but every 12-year-old who ever had a homework assignment on cloning has been there. And there's a lot of information up there. If you want to see what the laws are from those other countries I mentioned, we've got them on the site. If you want to see what proposals have been put into Congress and state legislatures, we have those on the site. A lot of other articles and opinions and so forth, even student comments and so on are there. So that might be a fun place to look. You're going to really make me, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put this card right down here if you want to get it. That's the easiest way to do it. You can just copy it right off the card. I'll just leave a couple of them out here. Well, thank you.